So like so let's say you're doing labor law, like the law of collective bargaining. You could do that as a video capture for students to watch ahead of time. Sorry, where are we on already? I might be speaking.
Yeah, it's all right.
Anyway,
yeah.
And then so students watch that video capture ahead of time, and then when they get into the classroom, they can just ask questions. So you can actually make it, and then it's called a hybrid class.
Yeah, that's all the rage these days.
So let's see. It looks like we're supposed to officially start. So I punched the record button. Eileen, are you on? Eileen Hoffman? Not yet.
Yes, I am on.
Oh, very good. Okay.
I'm here.
All right. So I guess we should officially start. It says it's well, on the West Coast, 9:32.
I have the same. I have 12:32.
Well, there you go. So you can see the screen, I take it, the
Yes.
PowerPoint slides.
Yeah,
So,
part one.
and so there are probably some people who are on this Zoom session that maybe weren't there yesterday. So let me go back, and this is the second of the two-session workshop, I guess is technically the right phrase. And we held the session yesterday, which we think turned out to be chock full of interesting ideas, and some of those were captured in a long series of chats, which we saved thanks to Bernadette Tiemann and made available to all of those who were attending yesterday. And this is the second of the two-session workshop. And so each panelist has up to 5 minutes to make some comments, and each discussant the same. And audience members can ask questions through probably the chat feature is the best way to do it, and or make comments as occurred yesterday. Let me go back for a second here. Yesterday we focused on what is the problem in terms of attracting millennials and Gen Zs to courses in labor and employment relations. And Eileen and I are co-moderating the session, and our panelists are listed here. Their biographical information is available on the LIRA website. Janice is with us, as is John and Peter and Richard. Christine Reardon has another commitment at this time, so she won't be on this session. And the same is true of our first discussant, Daphne Terrace, who has another commitment, but Mark and Heather are here. And what we want to do today is focus on this question, given what we stated, or various of us, what is the problem? Now, what do we do about it? That's basically what we're looking to focus on, and we'll share some experiences and go from there. So with that said, and I'll get this off the screen in a minute or two, I guess we should turn to, if we do the same order as yesterday, why not?
Janice,
Janice, yeah. Janice, it's you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I'll just jump right in, assuming that many people have heard yesterday's. First thing, somebody said, don't pick prime time if you're an elective. And let me tell you, a good time is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Lots of faculty don't like to teach in late afternoon, but students think it's completely normal and they love it. So I taught from 3 to 4:30 and had a good time. Now, first thing, changing the title. You know, I'm in a business school, and frankly, being a full professor's chair, one course you're allowed to do essentially what you want if you have some enrollment, and I love law. But titles like comparative labor law or international labor law or even multinational labor law, there's no such thing as multinational labor law, don't cut it, means nothing. So I sat there and thought about how to focus on what students need, or at least think they need, and what they're interested in. Now, at the Wharton School, they are future international managers. In fact, even maybe much higher than that, depending on their background. Some of you know I love international things, and I've thought of ILO fundamental rights as a frame. But when you think about that, you think, what are companies facing? I see Mark there. I think of global supply chains. I think of free trade agreements and all this sort of thing. yesterday we talked about what are the buzzwords.
Mhm.
And so I titled my course, first of all, human rights. Now there's a buzzword, but it's actually almost never used in American labor law, as if, I don't know, human rights is something else. I just finished a book on that human rights and labor law, labor rights seem to have gone in parallel tracks. They don't cross, which is odd when you think about our values. So I used international human rights and globalization. It doesn't have to be globalization. You could do this just for the United States, but it's trendy. And the way I framed it is the law should embody values that can be expressed as rights. So then the question becomes, but what rights? And that, for one reason, got me very much into what rights that are internationally recognized, because frankly, American labor law misses a lot. So that's why I said, well, if we put it in a national focus, and not only should our managers know this, but then you can make some comments about the United States. Very visual generation. Remember I said yesterday, I had been teaching for a few years because I was a senior administrator, came back in and curiously my business administrator said, use videos, they love it. But what I did is I started out and I showed, or I made them stay late one day and I showed the pianist, which this generation hasn't seen. Most of you might think it's not that old of a film. And you might say, what does this have to do with labor? But I showed that and I said to them, why? I said, I want you to identify what can happen. You're middle class or even upper middle class. Most of you come from educated families. Here's a nice family, nice parents, siblings that get along. Look what can happen. And then we'll think about it. So they watched it and the assignment was, I want you to list the wrongs that occurred as you went through the film. In fact, I told them that when you're watching the film, make a list. I said, there weren't very many rights then, but list the wrongs. And then that's one column. And next to it, what right should there be? They say there was a violation of that right. And I did give them a hint. I said, you can read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And by doing that, I got them into this rights framework, by the way, of thinking about it. One thing may surprise you. One of the things that did bother them, I'm sure most of you have seen the film, is the scene early on where the father's walking down the sidewalk and he's slapped right in the face by these Nazi soldiers and told to walk in the gutter. And I said, well, what bothered you about that? And really it was that there was an infringement of human dignity. So from there I asked them, do you have human rights? So they all look at you and say, well, of course, I'm human. And you say, do you have them 24/7? And they think that's about, you could just tell her, well, of course, if you have human rights, you have them 24/7. And then I said, do you have human rights at work, or do you leave them outside when you walk in? And there they stopped, because even if they've only had, student jobs, part-time jobs, most of them say, oh, they realize there might be some restrictions. So that's how we start. And that gets me into discussing, some of the, as many of you know, the fundamental rights, et cetera. And also trying to say you can be oblivious to gaps in your protection of your human rights or infringements. By the way, I showed a couple incredibly funny, and they're little tiny 1-minute clips from Cabaret, where Sally Bowles, who is completely oblivious to the fact that people are getting beaten to death on the sidewalk as she's chit-chattering down the street. So I did the 4 fundamental rights plus some basic safety considerations. And use some videos. Somebody mentioned it yesterday. Very interesting to assign them to read something about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, and then show them a video, clips of the Tanzine fire in Bangladesh. In fact, one of the students said he thought he was looking at a modern documentary sort of recreating Triangle when he saw the Tanzine one, until he realized the people were, South Asian. Historical parallels are so easy once you show them something modern, like show them a video clip of Cambodian female strikers being basically beaten by police, and then you show them some other things. Child labor is showing them something modern, and then show them the photos from Lewis Hine, really thrown up on a big screen. Yesterday, I saw it in the chat. My favorite one, on non-discrimination was something about equal pay. Equal pay is so hard to convey. You have one day, and the students don't know anything about how compensation is set. These are undergraduates, by the way, or anything about, gender wage gap. You show them Maid and Danningham, which is equal pay for work of equal value, because the women are doing completely different work than the men, and they get it. And so it was very interesting to pull that in. And then to talk about policy responses, particularly when you bring up freedom of association, to say, well, okay, now we realize something has to be done, but how do you do it? Do you do it through legislation? Do you empower people to have their own voice and be able to bargain? And we can get into freedom of association. And finally, I was going to say, we do cover, especially because it's a business school, corporate social responsibility, but we sort of challenge it by saying, well, does the corporation decide what it wants to abide by, or are there internationally recognized rights that a corporation is supposed to align its policies with? So we do that. And the last thing I'd say I changed was everybody tries to do this project or a final where you put them in a position. And what I did in one of my more successful finals was to give them a story that was in a newspaper from, I don't know, someplace in Pennsylvania, where there was an Amazon warehouse, and it's a basic occupational safety issue where people were collapsing in the 100-degree heat, being taken to the local hospital. And they kept working because they were afraid they'd be fired. And the hospital's calling up OSHA and saying, isn't there some violation here? But I'm asking the students, does this violate an international human right? And it really put them in the position of thinking about where we have coverage, where we might have coverage, but it's sort of inadequate for enforcement, and in a very local setting. So,
You didn't turn up your temperature in your classroom to 100 degrees to give them the real flavor of it, did you?
I wish I could have, right? Yeah, but it was really sort of interesting, because also the other thing I say is, when people think, oh, what happens in those poor, starving countries, if I could put it that way, and it doesn't happen here. And by the way, at the Amazon warehouse, of course, we call it Amazon workers, but actually they were hired by International Staffing Solutions, Inc., right? It's ridiculous. So it got the students more into that. So those were some of my ideas. I would love to hear others.
So let's, thanks so much, Janice. So let's we'll go in the order of listed and turn to John. Bud?
Okay, thanks. Before I forget, I'm sure a lot of people do similar things, trying to connect students with where they're at. And so like Janice said, I start off having them think about what they have, what they'd like in their own work. It's not going to come probably as any shock to anybody, though, but I do that in terms of efficiency, equity, and voice rather than human rights. But we're all, trying to draw the same connections. So I won't address every single question, but the first question was, have we made sort of changes in course content for marketing or enrollment purposes? And as I described yesterday, at the grad level, master's students here at Minnesota, we have a captive audience for labor relations. It's a required core course. We have sort of a semi-captive audience among undergrads. So we haven't made any content or marketing changes explicitly directed towards, directly increasing student enrollment, right? But that doesn't mean we're not cognizant of these issues, right? And so we've long worked hard to make sure our labor relations courses are relevant beyond the usual labor relations processes like organizing and bargaining. Not that those are unimportant, but going beyond that. This helps the class be well received among students and also seen as relevant not only by the students, but by our faculty colleagues. Because as I described yesterday, I think when these courses are required, right, the dynamic of who one of the key audiences shifts a little bit or expands a little bit, right? And then you have to convince your peers as much as students that the course is relevant and worthy of continued requirements. Right, but I think it's sort of easy pickings to a certain extent with labor relations, right? There's lots of ways in which labor can be very broadly relevant and give students sort of unique ways of confronting issues they don't get elsewhere. Janice has already described human rights. I don't think anywhere else in a HR curriculum or an MBA curriculum, except maybe corporate social responsibility, perhaps, right? You would get into human rights discussions. My own emphasis is seeing this as the only place in an HR curriculum where students confront alternative models of the employment relationship. Understanding labor relations, right? It's critical to understand, no pun intended, I guess, critical to understand a pluralist perspective. Labor law doesn't really make any sense from any other perspective. And so they need to understand that. But, you know, I'm a big believer in understanding comes through difference, and you can understand a pluralist paradigm more by understanding alternatives. And of course, much of HR is based on alternative paradigms, but you never see that in an HR course. They never make that explicit. And so a labor relations course is a great place to sort of serve multiple purposes, and not only a deeper understanding of labor issues, but also issues across HR. You know, there's other topics I think that are uniquely covered in labor relations that have much broader relevance: financialization, globalization, alternative models for tackling governing the global workplace, whether it's through ILO or European Works Councils or whatever. You know, and apologize for sort of the self-promotion, right? Everything I've talked about up till now, I try to do in my labor relations textbook. If we were doing this session 4 months ago, probably would have just sort of elaborated on that. You know, if we're doing this 3 months ago, would have talked about COVID-19 and relevance with health and safety and right to refuse and health and safety committees and things like that, right? So there's clear connections there. And of course, doing it today, right now, for tragic reasons, unfortunately, right, there's a deep societal interest in police unions and social justice. And so there's obvious connections that we can make with our students there, right? So there's lots of ways to make a labor relations course broadly relevant. Doesn't mean that organizing, bargaining, grievance handling gets sort of second billing, but just, you know, expanding on core topics. The second question, just briefly, was what lessons have you learned? Well, mandates are good when they work in your favor, right? Having a required class is good. And then the last thing I want to say, I don't know whether this fits under business case or whatever, but Eileen, you have a...
You're on mute, Eileen. You're on mute, Eileen. You want to unmute yourself?
You don't know.
Okay, yeah, you've got just a few seconds left, John.
Sure.
You were going to do a second.
So the last thing I just wanted to say is that we shouldn't forget that diversity of course offerings is also connected to diversity of intellectual perspectives and research agendas within academic departments, right? I think we've seen that homogenization of a curriculum, i.e. the erosion of labor relations and removal of labor relations and labor perspectives, right, goes hand in hand with homogenizing the intellectual perspectives in an academic department, right? And work is complicated, labor is complicated, we need diverse perspectives, right? And this includes not only diverse classes, but diverse faculty, including around different intellectual perspectives, right? And I think, you know, that gives sort of the urgency around making sure that labor relations courses are relevant and good enrollment, right? Because there's these broader sort of spillover implications, and we shouldn't lose sight of those connections. Thanks.
So Eileen, you reminded me yesterday, Eileen introduced the session and I was the ostensible rule enforcer about time.
Yes.
And we were switching roles today, and I think Eileen is a bit better at the enforcement rule than I was. So we're going to turn next to Peter Norlander, and in a bit of institutional self-promotion, I want to say, if you don't know, that Peter is a PhD graduate of the UCLA Anderson School, and well, I've known him since his student days. And so Peter, it's to you.
Thank you. So I was also a teaching assistant for Professor Lewin's human resources class, and when I became a professor myself, tried to implement some of the things I learned and found it very challenging. So I've grown better with experience, but I still aspire to you know, motivate students to be passionate about human resources and to learn in the same way. Two things I'll talk about are one, attracting people to come toward the field, maybe take a class in human resources or employment relations. I and other HR faculty do go to the introductory management course for all undergraduates, and they in their first year of their program, one of us will speak for 15 minutes about human resources as a potential major. So we hope to build a pipeline that way. I also have been involved in organizing public events that are employment relations related. So when we had a non-tenure track faculty unionization campaign, we had a event where we had the union perspectives, Jesuit perspectives, and we got a large crowd and interest. We have events regularly and try to attract public interest, and at those events I make a plug, take a class if you find this interesting. Inside the classroom, like Janice mentioned, I try to use clips and films, but I drop a lot of hints. Like, you should go watch the movie American Factory, and if you see it, come back and tell us. One student may watch it. They'll tell other people, I watched it, and conversation starts to build. So I try to encourage people to start making the connections about what is an employment relations topic. We are fortunate to have a strike almost every fall outside of our classroom. McDonald's decided to put their headquarters in downtown Chicago. There's almost always a protest outside of the, McDonald's, the CTU protest, CTU strike, the hotel worker strike, and the auto mechanic strike in the last 3 years have both been case studies that students have written about, and we follow events as they happen in real time, almost every class. So with that, idea of bringing in current events and bringing in current cases, I have developed a few. I put those on the discussion board. I would love feedback, and I'd love to collaborate on building more kind of short cases, either for discussion or for actual student work. So my course has negotiation exercises. There's the core content that everyone's kind of expected to learn, and then there are cases where you delve more deeply into a topic. And every fall I do go through a process where I say which ones are too old or not current right now, and what's coming up that I want to talk about. So I mentioned McDonald's. I've assigned the National Labor Relations Board joint employer case, just assigning the raw documents and asking students to read them. The Supreme Court case, Murphy Oil, other cases like that are very current. Students come in, they read them. They're sometimes very confused, and we have to talk about all of these issues. But that I think brings a level of immediacy to the topics. I do also do a lot of try to bring in Me Too, NFL players' rights. A few years ago, when Black Lives Matter and Colin Kaepernick issues, were beginning to attract national attention, bringing that discussion into the classroom and looking at what are the rights of players to speak, what are the rights of players who are co-workers to speak. So I always am trying to make connections to our course content. Sometimes it doesn't happen on the week I want it to, but see that what's happening in the world broadly is relevant to what we're discussing in class.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much indeed. Let's turn next to Richard Jenkins.
Well, hi, everyone. I don't have a lot of really interesting things to add. We talked about it already, but I can tell you, yesterday was the problem, today is the solution. Today, what I ended up doing is this course that I teach, I begged to keep alive. It was going to die out, and the union classes, and this is management unions and collective bargaining, I mean, this is straight union, have died out in MBA programs across the whole country. John Budd and I have exchanged some emails about that. And it's just a dying field in many ways, especially with the entrepreneurialism, as mentioned yesterday, as a rising field. But I wanted to keep the relevancy. I wanted to keep the class. I had a personal connection to that class. I wanted the MBA students to leave with it. So we talked about yesterday the challenges with the actual class getting smaller and smaller and the enrollment not being the same as the other classes. I think the solution, now this is graduate level quantitative MBA, so this may not apply to undergrad. This may, and for you folks that actually have mandatory classes, I mean, obviously that's, all you got to do is keep it relevant and you're going to keep going. But in terms of an elective class in an MBA program where they charge $7,000 for a class, there's a couple things you have to do. And I'll tell you what I'm big on data, Chicago's that way. So I've always done polling, and let's talk about the very beginning. So the very first class, I have people raise their hand. I say, all right, you've started a new job. There's a union. The union is not particularly good or bad. It's not particularly expensive or not expensive. There's no no reason, from the union side, you wouldn't join it. Would you join a union if you were in a unionized environment? And initially 10, 20 years ago, it would be maybe 2 or 3 people would raise their hand. These are Chicago MBAs, very conservative. Now, I've noticed that as time has gone by, more and more raise their hand. And last summer, more than half the class raised their hand that they would join the union, which really surprised me. And I'm going to be really surprised about this one. So I do think that we all talk about how to make our classes more relevant and attractive. I think that the wave might be coming from the students themselves. I think they are actually getting more progressive, even in a very, very conservative bastion as University of Chicago MBA program. They're still getting more progressive. So what I did to attract more students is I changed my course description. I included some progressive stuff. I said, do you have social justice warrior genes? Or do you have social justice warrior antibodies? Both are welcome. I didn't say both are welcome, but that's the whole point of, if you are a social justice warrior, you want to move forward and make some changes in the world with your MBA, this is a class for you. And I also said that if you are somebody who does not believe in the progressive labor movement, that this is actually something to make you understand it. That really seemed to make a big difference. It really did. So, appealing to the more progressive side of the students seems to make a big difference. I have a huge problem with relevancy. Our cases, at Chicago, we use a lot of Harvard business cases. There really isn't anything available. A lot of the films and stuff on labor and strikes are old videotapes, converted, they're just dated. And that's my biggest problem right now, is actually making it relevant. I think the police union, which I'm going to start out with this time because that's very relevant and ties into grievance procedures and contractual rights, and how do they actually get that in a contract where someone signed it, which is interesting as well with public sector unions. So my challenge now is relevancy, but in terms of actually increasing enrollment, I did exactly what everybody it gave me as instructions. I increased the negotiation. There's no graduate student in an MBA program wants less negotiation. They always want more. So I'm going to do a negotiation exercise the very first day, which is the strike. If you guys don't know that, it's a Harvard business case where labor can just pound on the head of management and pound and pound and pound and create enormous damages. And in the end of the game, if you had settled early, everybody made a lot of money. If you settled all the way late in the strike, everybody lost all the money. And it shows how quickly people move to that antagonistic. So I start out with negotiation. I do John Budd's Zinnia. That really is a challenge for a lot of the MBA students who think it's going to be very easy and straightforward. It isn't. It can become very complex for them. So I also held the class on a Tuesday. I didn't know that was a big deal, but apparently it is, because boy, the enrollment went right on up. And so I think that's it. Make it relevant, make it more progressive. I think our students are getting more progressive, and add negotiation.
Thank you.
Very good, Richard. Thank you. If you just happen to join this session, the last of our panelists from yesterday, Christine Reardon, is tied up with another session, and so won't be with us this early afternoon East Coast time. But our discussant, 2 of our 3 discussants are with us. Daphne Terrace is not, but Mark Anner and Heather Grob are. And so let's turn to Mark, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Great. Thank you. So, actually, I asked David and Eileen yesterday if I could say a few words about Penn State. So maybe a little bit modifying my role as a discussant. I think the speakers were so precise and clear. I think those lessons are very appropriate. So let me just say, how we approach some of these challenges there. I'm got a couple of slides that I'll share now, if this works. Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. So we started maybe 8 years back. 6, 7 years back, an MPS program in labor and global workers' rights at Penn State. So this is at the master's level. It's a professional degree program. But I will say how that I think links to undergraduate studies. And I would get a lot of questions about, wow, the field seems to be in trouble. It seems to be in decline in so many places. How is it at Penn State you seem to be growing what you're doing in our master's program and other aspects of the program. So I thought I'd, I just got 3 slides and try to summarize what we did. So this is 2014, we got started. How do you establish and how do you recruit students for a new MPS program in workers' rights? And this is, our reflections on it, and it's a lot of what's being said here today. Make it exciting, make it relevant, have great faculty. And the clincher was join a pre-existing global network. So what we did was, as we established, this is a Penn State master's program, but we're networked in to the Global Labor University, which has similar programs, really some top universities in Brazil, Germany, India, and South Africa. So that network part, and in fact, we were the 5th campus to join. They did a tremendous amount of work to help us recruit students. And we, very quickly were able to get, classroom. We weren't looking for a huge classroom. We didn't expect one, but at least we started with 2014 with 4 students. These are all people who, mid-career professionals. Shirley Price was one of them, domestic worker from Jamaica who ends up leading the Domestic Workers Union. That was our first year. I'm not going to show you all the, this was last year's program. Students from Liberia, students from Brazil, students from Ukraine, students from Turkey came into the program. And this is our current program. It's 12 months. They start in August and go to August. So right now they're doing virtual internships. They should be doing internships in person with unions, but they're doing virtual internships. Nigeria, Bangladesh, India, Cameroon, really Peru, students from all over. So a couple of things to say about this too, and how it links to other things we're doing at Penn State. So far, we've had 6 cohorts, 36 students from 18 different countries. And I think one of the very exciting things about this is we have classes. I teach one, it's an honors course for undergraduates, and it's combined with these master's students. Then I teach another course that's for HR, predominantly HR students, that's also combined with this. So when you combine these worker rights students with undergraduates for discussions and with HR students for discussion, I think really incredible things happen. I always encourage, you cannot sit next to each other if you're in the same program. From day one, when they're doing introductions, worker rights students interview HR students and then do the introductions that way, the same with the undergraduates. And we're talking a lot about this generation and what matters for this generation. And it's the sense of fairness. It's been said, students are more progressive. I see all of that at Penn State. I think this generation also values what I would say is authenticity. They're looking for professors that have been in the trenches and can say things. It seems to really matter a lot, more so than I had seen years ago. And this question of authenticity, I think, really helps when we bring these students together. So we've had discussions on child labor, and some of the undergraduate students or even the HR students saying, well, I don't really understand this. How does this happen? And we would have a student from Liberia who worked for Bridgestone Firestone as a child laborer at the age of 6 in our classes, right? Explain, well, let me tell you how it was for me. My dad had to do, so much tree tapping to get the rubber. He would have to work 21 hours to meet the goal. So we brought on 3 or 4 of us from the household to work with them. Domestic workers, Shirley, who I mentioned, talking about what it was like for her to be a domestic worker, and her first story where, she works in a home, a wealthy home in Jamaica, and in the evening after a very long shift, she's basically shooed into the backyard and it starts to rain, and she, her story, she uses the doghouse to sleep. But these stories have tremendous impact. So not seeing this program in an isolation, I think really helps keep an interest. And our undergraduate interest in labor studies, there's a concentration now, and 1/3 say they're interested in labor studies. So I think this, among many factors, is contributing to that. And we just do a lot of other things to build a community. I think David was referring to the idea of a community. We have online courses now. We're doing one now post-COVID. We have 18,000 people have participated in these different courses. We are a host of a journal, the Global Labor Journal. We do a labor column. This is all through the Global Labor University, about every 2 weeks. So we keep it very topical. And we do annual conferences. There are over 600 alumni from the Global Labor University around the world. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Okay.
If I could see that, I have to stop sharing.
Thank you, Mark. So let's move to our next discussant, Heather Grob. Hello, Heather.
Trying to unmute there, and also apologies in advance if my cats make an appearance. They seem to be quite awake, interested this morning. So, wow, there's just so much to think about, and such great number of ideas and comments that everybody, the panelists and people in the chat, have been offering. And so I think it would be a great service for us to provide that to people who might not have been able to attend today. I'll just mention a few things, maybe just highlight some things that I think have been discussed in many ways, but some other things that I'm thinking about too is a lot of what we've been talking about is really trying to deal with some preconceptions that people have when they're coming into the class. In my own experience is that most of my students are undergraduate business students. I've been trying to get other history majors and others and social workers and other people to come into the classroom, but but it's been a little difficult, and a part of it's because of our curriculum. But I think that the more that we can link it to more of the core curriculum, which is what I'm trying to do now, will be helpful. So I think that there are a couple of things in terms of dealing with preconceptions, some really good ideas that people have about how to draw people into what a union is, what it means, and also dealing with the idea that maybe it's worry that it's not diverse enough topic for people. And so we have some really good examples of how we might be able to move forward on that. I love a lot of what Janice had to say this morning about focusing on the international, multinational kind of issues. Really great ideas there. It's interesting in our situation. I think that a lot of our students really want to end up doing international work, and so they're really interested in it. But then they end up, by and large, staying pretty local. So, so it'd be a good hook, though. A couple of things that I thought I would also mention is that I think we also need to think about how we diversify our own curriculum and ways and our own organization at LYRA. And I know that Adrian will be working a lot on that, as well as the new president. I think the drawing people into a more pluralist view is extremely important and something that I focus on a lot. And it's also something that I think you need to really make visible for students when you're teaching. Like, this is what we're doing. You can't just have the HR perspective on things, because work has to do with life and has to do with all of the things we've been talking about and seeing present day. And so I think, little plug for John Budd's book, he deals with that really well. And so we straight off, after, I do some of the hooks that we've been talking about, my students and I straight off get into some of those discussions about different schools of thought and different paradigms and how people can see things in different ways. And I think that's really valuable for my students, but then you have to tell them it's valuable also. So, so as I mentioned yesterday, I think the more that we can do to highlight for our students very visibly what are the skills that you are developing. And I'm just going to turn to my document there so I can talk about that. For instance, that you're doing case summary and interpretation, some of the legal side of things, very important. Negotiation, being able to debate, using simulations, again, highlighting that you as a manager will have to behave ethically, and what does that mean in a pluralist society? Speaking and presenting, all of these strategies that students need to know that this is what I'm learning. So I did send for the Zinnia, I love the Zinnia assignment, and I've used it for several years, and I sent a link to a little blurb I did in our newsletter. Okay, did a little blurb in the newsletter about basically how we advertise that to our students and to other students. Okay, does that mean my time's
Yes.
up? Was that 10 seconds? Or, oh,
Yeah.
okay. Let me
We'll
just
give you
finish
10 seconds. Yes, you
okay,
can
let me
finish.
just finish with a few things. I will say that I love using movies in my classroom. I do an assignment where they have to watch, choose one and watch it outside of class. But I actually found out that a lot of these are only available on DVD, and they, you know, unless they want to pay money to access them. And I actually had students who said they didn't know how to use a DVD. So, and so I had to set up something with the library so that they knew, you know, they would show them how to use a DVD and how to put it into the, because a lot of computers don't have DVD players anymore. And so this was actually a functional issue that I had there. We have had in the chats lots and lots of ideas for films, both long form and shorts, which I would love to see Lyra provide on a teaching, you know, part of the website. And also I will say that I think that, well, I talked about preconceptions. Yeah, the movies, they don't know how to use them. Oh, Zinnia. I love the Zinnia. I think that I've always been perplexed about how much they give each other in their collective bargaining agreement. So they'll oftentimes work with end up having a 3 or 4% increase in salary and a bunch of other things that they're giving. We have a lot of social justice and a lot of concern about worker issues at our university. And so in a way, I feel like in some ways they're kind of too generous. And I don't think they're too generous, but I mean, if they were to go in doing that in the work, I mean, I haven't had a 3% raise in quite a while. So, so I think I've realized that if you're using the Zinnia, really make sure that they have to fill out the appendix portion in the back, which is like really showing what all of the different occupations are going to be paid, and calculating those costs, and then maybe even like having the management side of things do a cost justification to their leadership, I think would be helpful. Anyway, there's a ton that I think Lyra can do. I would love to see us doing a lot. Maybe we can talk about this in our discussion period here. What can Lyra do? We've had a lot of interest in maybe having a teaching conference. And so we were discussing this, David and Eileen, about maybe we need to discuss, you know, what would that look like? And what kinds of resources could Lyra put on the website to help everybody?
So thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
I want to turn back to Eileen for a minute, but let me just mention one thing that has come up in connection with a potential teaching conference and or teaching webinars that Lyra would do. I gather that Adrian Eaton, who's now the president of the Lyra, is appointing or reinventing a teaching committee that used to exist in the Lyra. And I think that is what is happening. And so we'll want to know more about that and see what ideas they might have and put them in touch with us about this. And I also want to turn to Eileen to maybe make some comments on what we've heard so far. Eileen, I should have said at the start that the standard deviation around 5 minutes per person is, I don't know, 60 seconds or 75 seconds. So Heather, we can say you were within a standard deviation of the time limit.
Right. Is my,
and that's
yeah,
good
go on.
because I cut mine short yesterday. So
No, you,
I think if you look at the 2-day, you know, average, I'll be right in there.
no, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. What we've dispensed with has been the wonderful introductions I would have given because if you've been at conferences, you know it could take for a long time. I mean, we've got a very distinguished and interested faculty. I would just mention that Janice has been very active in the international ELR, which is a very good thing for papers and discussion. And at Penn State, there's a VLIRA that started, a virtual LIRA, which is something that's great. Anyone can listen in with professors and other advocates giving their discussions. And it's usually at a civilized time for people who work. It might be at 7 or 8 in the evening. But there's an attempt for outreach, which is something that's good. And I would just summarize, the chat room yesterday was very rich with people's views about how do we deal with identity politics and how people look at the courses and use of current events and reframing, all very creative. And I think what we could do is take all of those comments, and especially since people said to everyone, so it isn't like a privileged discussion, and summarize them for further discussions here, because I think that it's a rich area, and we need to get more people interested and studying collective bargaining and negotiations. That's what I put my course in. But I teach at GW in their graduate, both their law school and their grad school, and they won't change the title of the course, which is collective bargaining. So what I've done is use word of mouth to say we do that, but we also do this. So I get students who are interested in the opposite, in beyond labor relations or labor union history, which I sneak in. But it's important that people see the background and how they can use this. And I like what Mark said about using what's happening now. In the chat columns, you heard that, if you had a chance to read them, there was a market basket and a whole demonstration in the Boston area. And that was used by Tom Koken and other professors. I think they also maybe were active in it. And the whole thing about graduate students or graduate assistants unionizing became important. And I would just say that one thing I did in my class, I teach 3 compressed classes, 3 weekends, which it may be crazy now with Zoom, but the students on one afternoon all had to give a presentation about a collective bargaining issue or an actual negotiation that they followed, either through the newspapers or talking to the parties. And they gave a discussion. We had a sort of a template of how to describe it, and got their peers to ask questions. So I found that including the students actually made it a lot more fascinating for them. Years in the past, I've asked them to read other books like Nickel and Dimed, and for a week they had to live on the minimum wage and come back and see how it was. So again, trying to get middle and upper middle class students whose parents might be in a union, but who might not be, thinking about what it's like to be on a certain wage, gets them at least thinking about things.
Your point about labeling, let's say using negotiations as differentiated from collective bargaining, there's a parallel that's going on right now in which ESG has replaced CSR. CSR was corporate social responsibility. Janice was mentioning this in her comments earlier. That's faded away in favor of something called ESG, which represents environmental, social, and governance. These are kind of exogenous factors influencing how organizations operate. And you can see that curricula in entrepreneurial studies now feature ESG prominently. Curricula in finance feature, among other things, ESG-oriented investing. So I'm not plugging for it. I'm just saying the point that Eileen makes about labeling, and many of you have also said this in the last couple of sessions, I think it's a relevant example. Let's hear from maybe some other people. Kelly, yes. Mike, you had something to say on the chat. Do you want to maybe verbalize that a little bit? It's pretty.
Yeah, we can see you now.
Yeah.
Me?
Yes,
Yeah, sure.
Kelly Pike.
What did I say in the chat?
It was
You
brilliant,
said,
whatever.
you
it
said
was.
that you also use modern times and you think it's
Oh,
it
oh, sorry.
felt,
Yes, from
as-
before.
yeah.
I was just, yeah, I didn't expect to really pose the question. I think the film idea is good, and you know, modern time using the older films, which sort of make fun of how rigid and mechanized work is, and so like that's how it was back then, and things have changed so much today. But really show the first like 6 minutes of manufactured landscapes where it's like spans a factory, and all you see is like, and then some workers sleeping on their desks at their machine, and then like it's really how much has work changed. Yeah, I don't know. I was just also looking through some of your film suggestions, David, and at first I thought, you know, are students going to connect with these? Are these older? But it's just, maybe it's the same thing. These themes persist, and why is that? But these are just observations and some bits I'm throwing out. I don't have a particular question at the moment.
Who else would like to make some comments and
Yeah.
help us out here,
I
Jen?
would. Yeah, I just have a quick question, a comment about what David said. I have noticed this use of ESGs, and I'd only say one thing in our field. At least my experience in the United States, the moment you say environmental and social, it's all about, you know, climate change and green and all that, which is fine. But somehow they don't think of labor as being part of this. And so it really struck me because I run a course each year where we go out to Southeast Asia, and I talk about sustainable things, and I talk about the SDGs. And after the first year, I realized that students thought that's only climate, isn't it? Now, curiously, if you go to someplace like Indonesia, yeah, they know what the UN 2030 SDGs are, and they know there's a lot about labor and equality, et cetera. So I have to say that once again, the American understanding of some of these terms is quite narrow. And that if you're talking about sustainability, it's not just the climate, it's about people. And
Right.
so we have to make sure that they understand what the new term means.
Actually, do I have time to say one thing, or are you?
Yes,
Sure.
we will let you, yeah.
I will say I find this very invigorating yesterday and today, because it's also in the time right now where I'm just touching up my course outline, and I teach industrial relations in the School of Human Resource Management at York University, very progressive leftist history of strikes, and my research areas in like global labor standards and global supply chain. So it's like I said in yesterday's thing, I feel like I spend a lot of time trying to swing the state, you know, like it's okay, this is not a bad thing. But I think the themes coming out from today about like the framing being very important up front, and a hook. You know, they're here. Like you made sense on a very human, universal level, why this matters and how this can be important to you. And then using whatever textbook we use, like I use David Dury's, he sort of talks about like, you know, the collective bargaining regime, the more like he talked about different regimes of thinking about the law of work. But then I think we need to leave spaces in our outlines to adapt and fill in with what's happening immediately. Like Peter was saying, there's strikes happening all the time here too. You know, like you see stuff happening at Queen's Park, the nurses, the teachers unions, our grad students, our contract faculty, because it's easy to get a bit lazy about just doing the stuff that's in your textbook. And finally, also coming from yesterday's, I was simultaneously reaching out to people I know who have been trying to update their outlines to be more intersectional and to talk more about race issues and LGBT issues. And so we need to do that, not just asking our Black colleagues, like our white colleagues need to do the work. And I think we all have a responsibility, especially this year, like not just talking about Black Lives Matter, but who's writing about these, who's taking a more intersectional approach to industrial relations. There's layers of oppression happening in there. And I think I'm invigorated by this conversation to think about how we can incorporate all these things. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, great. Any other comments? Peter?
Hi, so I was inspired just to hear first that there's a unanimous agreement that the Zinnia is an enormous public good for our community. And I hope that we can have more open source opportunities, possibly through Lyra, but even connecting with other scholars who are in this teaching position where we develop and share teaching materials. There was talk yesterday, you know, where can we put up our syllabi and just share ideas, or where can we, you know, post a resource or a material that we wouldn't mind other people sharing. And the hope being that, you know, there are developed over time something. So open source is a way, like the webinars have been wonderful for for outreach. Other projects that some fields are doing, like open source textbooks, or even hackathons where you go in and get a group of people together and edit Wikipedia together for an hour, building up resources on global labor standards that cite research in this community. That's a way of connecting to a broader audience and bringing people in this direction.
Say, Peter, if someone edits Wikipedia, which in my experience might be a rather formidable task, do they get paid for that, or are they performing some pseudo public service?
This is all service, and you're right.
Yeah, my impression is Wikipedia has some staff, they pay, but this is gratis.
Gratis, right.
Shannon Potter, are you interested in talking? I've just been looking at you,
Oh,
your body language.
yes. It's a lot to raise hand. Yeah, thanks. So sorry, this question is like too orthogonal to this the discussion, but I was just looking at the LERA website, and I was sort of interested whether LERA or anybody on here has resources that would help or support undergrad students unionizing. Personally, I only came to understand labor and even employment law through being a union member myself, which didn't happen until I was a grad student. And I know from talking to some undergrads, particularly on US campuses, that they, in attempts to unionize, just like completely lack resources, especially if they are going like an independent union route. And I mean, obviously, if more undergrads were in unions, they would have a better connection to industrial relations and maybe would then like feed into programs. So it may not be specifically teaching related, but I am just interested if anybody can connect resources. Yeah, thanks.
Interesting. I think most of the business schools probably don't have unions, but they might. But it's an interesting concept. Any comments from our panel or discussants?
Well, there's a pretty substantial literature, you probably know this, Shannon, on graduate student organizing, court decisions about it. I think I can recall from memory, there was the first article I ever read was by Sidney Ingerman on this. It was graduate students organized at Berkeley. I think it was published in 1965. But and of course, graduate students, as we all know, tend to be serving as RAs and TAs. I must say I can't identify a source on undergraduate unionization, Shannon. Hopefully somebody can.
Can I just say, I can't, but I just want to make a comment. It gets particularly confusing because the law that would cover it for state universities is your own state's laws or your own state courts, response to it. And in the private sector, where you would think there could be bargaining, the National Labor Relations Board in the last, 15 years has been just flip-flopping all over the place. If it's a Republican board, they're against graduate student organizing, and if it's a Democratic majority, they flip. But the real problem for undergraduates, I would think, is this aspect that often when they're working at a university, it really is considered a part of financial aid, and it is very separate from, when I say separate, but if you're working in the cafeteria, it has nothing to do with actually your coursework. Whereas for graduate students, it's it often is very merged to your studies, and it's required, and it's easier to make the argument that they're employees than it is for undergraduates.
Yeah, those comments remind me that one of the issues among many that have come before the board has been the joint employer issue involving especially franchisors and franchisees. And it's rather remarkable that even fast food franchisors and franchisees also use non-compete agreements.
Yeah.
I used to think that those were for high-level professionals and so forth.
Right.
No,
But they're not.
Really widespread. So I try to bring these examples into the classroom when I teach. They're contemporary, and there's the flip-flopping that you mentioned, Janice, just depending upon who it is that populates the board. I have a notice here that says the Presidential Address and Lifetime Achievement Award is supposed to start in 14 minutes. So I'm happy to stay on for a little longer here, but we probably should be trying to wind down fairly soon. Does anyone else have something they'd like to say, a point they'd like to make?
Yeah, and this undergraduate part, just to jump in, Mark, I really, I mean, just at Penn State, it's a large state university. The vast majority of the undergraduates work in one way or another. And I just feel it's the best way to start the conversation. And some of the first ice-breaking activities, tell us about your first job and what it was like, and a lot of them are working on campus, off-campus food services. They've got a lot of rich experiences, and it's just another way of authenticity, whatever you want to call it, just lived experiences. It really gets the conversation going.
Peter says he uses collective bargaining in college dorms, a case. Is that right, Peter?
Yes, so that's about residential assistance at UMass Amherst. It's provided free from SHRM as a teaching case. I should say with the cases I'm talking about, I either have a very short discussion-based case, we do it in the class in one session, or I say you can pick from this menu of cases at the beginning of the term, and a group of you will present on it later in the term. So that's an example of like a large case that a small group of students, and I usually get one or two who are actually RAs to read it and then present it to the class and lead a discussion of the issues raised.
So do you ask any of those UMass students if they shopped at Market Basket?
No.
Who else? Anyone else? Yeah, please. Lisa Jordan. Hi, Lisa.
Hey, this is just a complete aside, but when I was teaching undergraduates, I, for a while, taught a class that was an HR class, but there was a unit on unions in it, and it came in about halfway through the course. So about midterm, I would come into class before we got to that unit, and I would say to them, I've been looking at your grades, and on average, I think the grades are too high this semester. So I decided to rework the syllabus, and I've decided that we're going to add a 15-page paper, and I'm going to reproportion the percentages of the grade that you have, and you can just watch them go nuts. And they're like, well, that's not fair. And I say that, well, but it's my class, and I can kind of function my class the way I want, and it's not going the way I want right now. And I kind of started this from Barbara Fick, who was a labor law professor that I had at Notre Dame when I was there years and years ago. But it's brilliant because they're like, well, I'm going to complain. I'm like, who are you going to complain to? What are you going to do? And then pretty soon they're like, well, we'll get a petition together. We'll all go talk to the dean together. And so by the end of class, I've explained to them about what unions do and why people join unions, and that an employer, unless you have a union contract, can come in, this happened to my mother, and cut her pay $7 an hour. And so what I just did to you is what it is to be a worker in a workplace without union representation. And you did everything workers want to do to protect themselves. And I think that's one way. Somebody was talking about UFCW. I used to work for the UFCW. The worst thing that can happen is to get undergraduates who's been baggers. I negotiate those contracts. The baggers have such high turnover. We never worry about what they get paid or how they get treated because they don't vote on the contract. So the worst thing is to have people who are baggers in grocery stores in your classes because they hate the union. And to be fair, like it's just, so that seemed to have worked for me in the past, to do that little thing with them, because then suddenly they are the worker, not somebody out there. But anyway, that's it.
This is Richard. I've had my class unionize on me 3 times.
I was going to say, Lisa, we actually did try to unionize in Teresa Ghilarducci's labor economics class. And we said that we had all studied so hard. We were very prepared for the exam. We didn't feel like we needed to take it. And she said, well, let me give you the first lesson in bargaining, which is I have all power. And she said, you're going to take the exam. I will give you the same grade if you want it.
I actually started as a bagger. That was my first job. I was a member of the UFCW local in Minneapolis, and I was a bag boy back then. And it actually didn't make me anti-union. There were some issues who got the cashier jobs, but no. So it's been very interesting for me to follow the discussion. So I teach a class at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and a lot of my students, like one of them who spoke on COVID-19, is going to work for Bain Capital, you know, another one's going to work for Citibank. So they don't go the traditional labor route. But for me, both introducing this idea, the concept of fairness with universal rights, you have these universal rights, but the applications wildly vary, is something that strikes a chord. And the other is connecting it up to much bigger trends that they find relevant. You know, the trade, the supply chains, the bigger fights, and then also pulling them in, giving them opportunities. And DC is a great place for that. I've had students come in and give a talk at the Department of Labor. I'll probably have some come in to give a talk at USAID, but connect them as much as I can to practitioners. And then identifying really the fun part is, here's what it says in paper, and here it's a total mess in application. You know, how do you deal with that? And then turn it over to them and give them as much latitude as possible within the framing of the class to take a topic, a subtopic that they like, and to run with it.
Thanks, Jeff.
So you were a bag boy, you said.
I was we called them bag boys back then. The big
Bag boys.
Yeah. So if you
was bag boys, only women, only girls got the cashier jobs. And so one of my colleagues, another boy, filed a grievance, but lost.
you all might want to, after this is done or at some point, click on, I guess, YouTube and look for Bunker Boy. Let's just say it's a parody that you might enjoy.
It's pretty good. I know what you're talking about.
You do.
Yeah.
It's not Sarah Cooper, but it's almost as good.
Hey, Deb, but I was going to say, if you want to try to get the chats again, I'm glad to add that onto the list of things so that I don't know how we can push that out to everybody. Probably just put it on this section once I summarize that. I think that would be a great help for people to start.
And I just clicked on my screen at the right-hand side where it's got 3 dots, and the first line is save the chat.
Right.
Oh, good.
Bernadette put me onto this yesterday. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known. So kudos to her.
Yeah, if you want to just send it to me, that'd be great.
Yeah. I can send it to everybody, I think.
Yeah, I think you
Okay. I guess, Eileen, are we going to sign off?
Yeah, I think we're going to sign off. And this is a wonderful, it's been a fun panel, both panel 2 and panel 1. I'm looking forward to panel 3.
Very fun.
Yeah, thank you. And David, you get the last word.
Just thank you all. All the best.
Thank you.
No.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Enjoy.
Thank you.